To your daily dose of nature with natural habitat adventures. Today's topic, nature photography in tropical destinations. Our presenter today is Dr. Court Whelan. He's coming to us live from Boulder, Colorado. And Court has received his education in Florida at Florida State University, right, Court?
Ooh, University of
Did I
Florida.
mess it
Sorry
up?
to
See,
call
I
you
don't
out
have
on
your
that.
bio up with me
Haters,
today, so you're going to have
haters.
to tell everybody. That's
It's
so
okay.
bad. University of Florida.
Hey,
So
it's all
I'll let you tell everybody the rest of your story.
funny, funny. No, that's great. Thanks, Lee, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. Yeah, born and raised in Florida. I live in Colorado now, and we have just some spectacular spring weather upon us. I could not be happier. So things are looking pretty good here, but we're going to kind of transpose and digitally put you in the world of the tropics for the next 45 minutes or hour or so. And this is, I guess I'd like to think of almost as like a trilogy of presentations. If you've been tuning in weekly or even daily, I know a lot of you have. You've noticed the last couple of weeks I've been personally presenting on photography lessons for African safaris, and then last week was polar regions, so like the Arctic and Antarctica. And this is kind of covering a lot of the rest of the bases today with tropical adventures. I've been guiding around the world, but focusing frankly on the tropics more than most other places for about the last going on 20 years, leading photo adventures and naturalist safaris, biodiversity adventures. And nothing quite says biodiversity and excitement and adventure and expedition like the tropics. As I'm looking at this photo of this orangutan and as I'm thinking about the tropics, thinking about going to the tropics, I have to say, as awesome as Africa is, as awesome as the polar regions are, there's nothing that excites me probably more than the opportunity to go to the tropics, mainly because of the grab bag, the mixed bag, like the unknown, the hope of what you are likely to encounter. Because there's so much biodiversity in the tropics, you don't know what you're going to see each and every trip, but you know you're going to see a lot, and every single trip offers a chance to see some really, really extraordinary things. So you'll probably see throughout the course of this presentation, I talk a lot about versatility, and that's a huge common theme with going to the tropics because there's so much to photograph, from big to small to in the middle to landscapes to travel to marketplaces to really, really cool stuff. So I'm using the word tropics relatively free. I mean, if you think of like the two tropic zones, we've got a lot of countries that we currently do trips to. But really, when I'm talking about tropical photography, just to get your head aligned with what we're going to be discussing today, it's jungles, it's rainforests, it's cloud forests, it's places that are for the most part warm, for the most part humid, and for the most part are in tropical areas with high biodiversity. From big to small, and you'll see that in the coming slides. So I guess, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. You'll also notice I do have a blue pointer on my screen today. This kind of helps me because since we are talking about photography, I'll probably talk about some various features to the photographs. So that is intentional. I'll try to keep it as far off the screen when I am showing photos just for the sake of photos, but nevertheless, it is an intentional pointer to help me point to you the things I want you to see as part of the photo. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So when we talk about photography in the tropics, there are some inherent challenges and opportunities, but let's start off with challenges. Then I'm going to talk about the gear that I typically bring with me, and this is gear for everyone out there, whether you're a novice intro photographer, whether you're an iPhone photographer, whether you are a seasoned semi-pro, serious hobbyist, or true pro photographer. I'm going to try to cover all the bases succinctly, and then go into the last half of the presentation with very specific techniques. What are my top things that you should be either practicing now or just considering when going into a tropical photo adventure? So starting off with challenges, right off the bat, you're dealing with a lot of heat and a lot of humidity in the tropics. It presents a very, very different situation. Here's a forest in Borneo, and there's nothing to me that says heat and humidity quite like the jungles of Borneo. You might be dealing with temperatures, 89, 90, 91 Fahrenheit, which is not actually that hot, but like 110% humidity. Not really, you can't get above 100, I don't think, but it feels humid. So it presents certain challenges, not just to your own stamina, but to, how our camera gear should and can function as well. You have two seasons in the tropics. When we talk about polar regions, we're not, there are different seasons, but it's not like we have a lot of year-round travel. In the tropics, you absolutely can travel throughout the year. For most tropical regions, you have two seasons. You have the rainy season and then the rainier season. And I say that because, at any time of year, even though it's the dry season, you could get rain. So no matter whether you're going in the height of the rainy season or the height of the quote unquote dry season, you should be ready for that weather. But the upside is that you get spectacular scenery like this, where the sun can be shining through the clouds behind you, illuminating the foreground, beautiful foreground here with these lovely kind of blue and light blue and almost violet colors coming through. So a lot of opportunities there with that change in season and the difference that rain and thunderstorms can bring. One of the most challenging and surprising things about tropics photography is that jungles are surprisingly dark. You would think, oh, it's the tropics, it's sunny, it's the equator. I'm just thinking of like warm beaches and palm trees. When you get into proper jungles, here we are in Danum Valley, beautiful rainforest in Borneo specifically. I mean, it's surprisingly dark. And even when I'm there with photo groups, I'll be standing right next to people and I'll be saying, you know, hey, listen, I want to remind you this is a dark scene, because once we've been in it for an hour or two and our eyes are adjusted, our eyes are amazing, amazing instruments, and we can perceive lightness in dark very, very well. And we must remember that the camera, being a digital instrument, is much more binary. It's you know, it doesn't adjust and receive and perceive that dynamic range like our eyes do. So we have to remember that it's actually fairly dark when we're in the middle of rainforest, even if we're in the top of the canopy like these rainforest walkways here. One of the most aggravating things, but prevalent, is backlit animals. Animals, especially big apes and monkeys and orangutans, like this male orangutan here, they sit up in trees. And you know, if they're sitting in a patch where the sun is behind them, it's really challenging to photograph when that brightness is just behind them. You know, if you've been, you know, like me, and on a Zoom call or a Microsoft Teams call or a Skype call recently, and there's that person sitting in front of the window and then the window shining behind, you're like, you know, can you turn the window? That's kind of how we want to be with wildlife. We want the light to be shining on them. We don't always get that, so we have to make lemonade out of lemons in a lot of cases. And we'll talk about techniques as to how you can do this when you're on a tropical wildlife adventure like this. But at the end of the day, you know, all these challenges are opportunities, and there's so much to love about the tropics. You know, whether it's Central American tropics, like here we have, you know, toucans in Costa Rica and Honduras, where we're back over to Borneo and we're seeing massive things like pygmy elephants, beautiful sandstone throughout Southeast Asia, incredible insects. You know, the thing is there's so much more diversity in the tropics than anywhere else in the world, that the range of photographic opportunities, the range of subjects, the range of things that you're going to point your camera towards is far greater than anywhere else on the planet. So you have to have that high level of adaptability, and that's what we're going to get into for the rest of the presentation. So let's talk about the gear first off. Now, if you've been in the previous two presentations, you're going to see a lot of similarities here. We're going to go over some of the main talking points, and we'll hit each one of these, whether in this next gear section or later on in the presentation. So, you know, we're going to talk about, you know, do you have a point and shoot versus DSLR or a mirrorless? What's better for tropics? What are the best lens combinations? What do I bring with me? You know, we can only bring so many lenses. We can only bring so much gear. What do you choose, Court? What are my top choices here? Memory cards and backup, batteries and charging. You know, are there charging issues in the tropics typically? Do I need stabilization? Do I need to bring a tripod with me? How do I protect my camera from rain and moisture and humidity? Do I need to bring a second camera body? All these things are very, very important questions when thinking about the tropics. So another similar slide, you know, I replaced the Nikon camera on the top right with the Canon, just because, you know, I'm a Canon guy, whatever. Canon, call me. But nevertheless, all the camera brands out there that are making lots of cameras nowadays are really, really solid. So I'm not truly endorsing one brand over the other, but I'm just trying to give some examples, because a lot of people do want an actual tangible example of like, hey, what camera have you seen work really well? So we've got three main categories here. The top left, I'm going to point, we got a general power shot. Both Canon and Nikon, even Fuji and Panasonic make great versions of this. This is like a mid-range point and shoot. Okay, these things range, you know, around $500 or $600. They have extraordinary telephoto capabilities, so you can shoot way high up in the treetops. You can zoom out for a landscape shot. You can hit a button for a macro function. It's all in one small package. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we'll talk about the DSLRs, or the mirrorless cameras. You know, these are Canons, Nikons, Sony, Olympus. They're all making great products these days. This is going to be kind of like your upper end, your higher range. And of course, you can further divide these in what's known as crop frame versus full frame. And that's something, you know, I haven't mentioned that a lot because I didn't want to bog folks down too much, because I know we have a wide variety of people listening today and to previous webinars. But one thing you want to think about, especially for the tropics, is to figure out, if you don't already know, if your camera body is what's known as a crop frame or a full frame camera, and what your crop factor is. What that means is if you have a crop frame camera, which is what a lot of more intro DSLRs are, you actually get more telephoto than you think you do. So it's an important thing to understand when choosing lenses. We'll come and circle back to that in a second. So you have on one end, you have the good point and shoot with a lot of telephoto. On the other end, you have the very cream of the crop, big fancy DSLR. You're changing lenses. There's something new in the middle nowadays, and Sony, I think, is really, this is where I will give them the endorsement. They're really running away with it in a big way. I just heard from someone, I think Nikon has come out with a great one, and Panasonic as well. So a lot of the camera manufacturers are doing what's known as bridge cameras these days. Bridge is like a toll bridge. And what it is it's got a lot of the power of a crop frame or an intro SLR, so like an intro big fancy camera, but you don't have to change lenses. It offers the equivalent of a 24mm to 600mm lens built right in, right there on that zoom barrel. And it's a one-stop shop, and it's very, very high quality. These run considerably more than your advanced point and shoots. They're really not, they're barely considered a point and shoot. They're called a bridge. But they run about $1,500, and I have to say, I've seen more of my guests bring these on trips recently and love them than any other new type of camera system out there. So I really, really like it. This is for the person that wants good quality, maybe not the perfectionist, tippy top, cream of the crop, pro National Geographic quality, but very, very good quality, great quality in low light, but doesn't want to have to change lenses. This is for you. So I do have an SLR. I do change lenses, and I know a lot of you out there probably do as well. So what is my go-to kit? Well, again, I shoot on a full frame, so these numbers represent the actual focal length. If you had a crop frame, you'd magnify this by like 1.5 times or something. Definitely worth looking into, definitely worth doing some research online if you're not familiar with that concept. But really, you can't go anywhere without your two basic lenses. I go with a zoom telephoto. This allows me to have range and versatility. Remember, versatility is absolutely key. While on an African safari, I might say, yeah, bring that big 500mm prime on a Borneo trip, on a Costa Rica trip, Madagascar, I don't recommend. I think you want a smaller lens because when you're hiking a lot, and I think you want more versatility in that zoom that allows you to zoom in and out and not just be fixed at one focal length. You're also going to want what I call a walking around lens. This is just the lens that's on my camera body when I walk out of the door in the morning. This is the lens I have on if I'm just walking around the rainforest and we're not sure exactly what's going to come up to the next corner. It's like my landscape lens, it's my travel photography lens. It's really my all-purpose walking around lens. It stays on my camera a lot. But because it's the tropics, well, not because it's the tropics, but the way tropics trips usually work is that you don't have super strict luggage limitations like you might for African safaris. That's one of the things very, very common to African safaris is you have to bring, no more than, let's say, 44 pounds or 61 pounds because of the small internal flights. Oftentimes in the tropics, we do have small internal flights, but there are usually ways around it such that, one of the vehicles will drive from point to point, so you're not with your luggage, or the flights are actually bigger commercial airlines, you can bring a few other things. So I almost always bring a couple, what I call X factor lenses. These are lenses that, aren't critical, but are really, really fun. And in some cases are really, really close to being critical and very important to me. So what do I choose? Well, one is my ultra wide. That's my 16 to 35mm. If you have a crop frame camera, that'd be like the equivalent of a 10 to 22mm. This is going to be like your really wide angle. It's going to be almost fisheye, but not quite the distortion at the edges. Then it's really a choice. I almost bring this everywhere I go. Then it's a choice between these two guys here. This is known as a nifty 50. It's a very shallow depth of field, wonderful travel lens. It's very, very small. It's a fixed focal length, so I can't zoom in, zoom out, but that aperture of f1.4 is kind of like on smartphones nowadays when you see that portrait mode, everything that's not in focus becomes nicely blurred. That's a beautiful lens for just, photographing your jungle lodge, photographing markets. It usually makes its way in my camera bag because it's so fun and so useful. Now here's the big one, okay? So a macro lens. This has not made it in my recommended gear list for the previous two webinars for Africa and polar regions. For tropics, it almost always comes with me. Now, this does not mean you have to go out and immediately buy a macro lens. I'm going to show you in a few slides from now how you can use your lens that you already have, your 18 to 55 or your 24 to 105, and turn your normal lens into a macro. But if you do have a macro lens, if you like photographing small things like bugs and flowers and frogs, this is a huge, huge bonus. What it does is it turns really small things into big full frame shots. Like it fills the frame of your sensor. So small little stick insects or beetles or small little poison arrow frogs are like magazine cover worthy, and they're just beautiful. Now here's the catch, is that if you're gonna bring a macro lens and go through that trouble, you should bring a macro flash, or at the very least make sure you have a flash on your camera. If you don't, you're really losing a lot of power in your macro. I'm not gonna go into any more detail than this, but what it is like, okay, yeah, I've got room for this. Do you have room for the other thing as well? And oftentimes that's where it's like, ooh, I don't know. But nevertheless, it comes with me. And smartphone, I don't leave home without it. I'm a guide, so I'm working on logistics, but also it's a great second camera. Memory, always bring plenty of memory. Make sure you bring, as much to take, up to 500 photos per day of your trip. That's usually just a general bellwether that I use. Memory is cheap, buy more. I'm not necessarily saying this is the right card for you. I think nowadays, these 64 gigabyte, 128 gigabyte cards are a lot easier than having to constantly change cards, every day or every couple of days. A laptop for backup and storage, that's totally up to you. Because we don't generally have as much weight restrictions when traveling on the tropics, then go ahead and bring it. Otherwise, bring extra memory cards, and that's usually fine. I do bring a laptop, but that's just because I'm working on logistics as well. Batteries and chargers. So this is a great thing for tropics trips. We had issues with batteries and chargers for the previous 2 regions of the world. Africa, sometimes you are on exclusively generator power, so you might not be able to charge batteries in your room. For polar regions, your batteries usually get zapped very fast. In tropical regions with the warm environment, you don't have that serious of an issue with batteries being depleted. In fact, it's no different than if you're just shooting at home usually. And for most of the time, jungle lodges do have full power, or at least full generator power into the room. So yeah, that's great. No real big issue there. Stabilization. So I don't bring a lot with me on trips to the tropics. I might bring a tripod, but that's the most. And here's the reason, and it differs quite a bit between other regions of the world, and that when you're going on trips in the tropics, when you're going out day to day and you're on trails and you're photographing wildlife and scenery, you pretty much are carrying everything on your back that you want with you for the day. Contrast that with a polar bear safari, that we do up in Churchill. We're on a polar rover, an actual excursion vehicle. We can, put our camera bag next to us as we're photographing out of the safari vehicle. Think of African safaris, same thing. You're in a vehicle. These trips to the tropics, most of the time you are hiking. Now there are definitely exceptions to that. I'm thinking to my most recent trip in Borneo on the Kinabatangan River. We're in a boat. So you have a place to put it next to you, but you have to think about, do you want to carry this with you? And I don't think any of this stuff is necessarily worth it for me. In addition, I'm not recommending you bring these big bazooka lenses, so you don't need as much stabilization necessarily. Go handheld, go minimal, go lightweight. You'll be much more comfortable. Between bringing one of these things versus an extra lens, bring the extra lens. And then just a few last considerations. Camera protection. So this is a big one for the tropics, probably more so than the other regions I've talked about in weeks past. You can do this in a few different ways, or all of the ways. These 2 top sections kind of address the weather protection. You can buy these things that are like little rain jackets for your camera. They work great. They're a little cumbersome. Your camera's not used to wearing a rain jacket, so it gets a little fussy. It might slide off of it. And at the end of the day, what happens if rain is dropping on the rain jacket and then circling around and finding it in some little nook underneath the jacket? You don't want your camera to get wet at all. So frankly, when it comes to camera protection, I just make sure I have a good backpack with me that has a legit rain cover. And I chose this photo online because I think it illustrates it nice. It's basically a little pack cover. It comes into like the size of a travel pillow. It unravels, and it through elastic band wraps around your backpack, and you can kind of see turned over, your backpack straps are still available to you. And usually because that part is hitting your back, even in a downpour, a big rainstorm, you're not really getting the back of the bag wet. So that works to completely waterproof your gear. If it starts downpouring, I'm probably not gonna be photographing in it anyways. So I'm gonna put my gear away and keep it safe. So I think backpack with rain cover is honestly the best camera protection you can have. And a second camera body, again, I think it's better to be lightweight. The second camera body for me is that smartphone on these trips to the tropics. Okay, cool. We've gotten through the gear. We're going to move on to the top photo tips, and that's going to round out the next half of the presentation. Okay, but first, a little sip of coffee. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few different things here. These are in not necessarily any particular order, but they're going to play off of each other in a few different ways. One thing that you're going to think about is when you're in the tropics, everything's flush with life. There is so much vegetation. It's pretty much always the green season in the tropics. We talk about in Africa, the dry season and the green season. There is a time when the landscape dries out in Africa. In the tropics, it really never does. So you think about a lot of vegetation and think of animals that are partially hidden. Of course, not every photo on a trip is going to be a partially hidden animal, but when you encounter these things, it's likely in the tropics. How to do it? Well, first of all, one of my techniques is to embrace the hiddenness, embrace the mystery, use that vegetation to frame your animal. And I think everybody kind of has expectations going into a photo safari or going into a particular national park or an animal sighting that they want to get that perfect Nat Geo cover shot. They want to get that thing where the animal's clear and it can go on the next guidebook for wildlife of Borneo or Madagascar or Ecuador. And I'd say that's great, but use what you've got and always use that vegetation to your advantage if you must. And I think it is really fun and kind of like an exploratory sense of storytelling when you can use that vegetation as like a little bit of a frame for your animal. In addition, the other good way to do it is to shoot on a shallow depth of field. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes of how to shoot on a shallow depth of field. But those are some really, really good techniques. And just to understand and expect that you will have animals that are partially hidden. But I'll be honest, I've been photographing pygmy elephants in Borneo for years now, and this is one of my favorite shots because I think it helps tell the story. These things are not obvious. Even though you think of an elephant as being this obvious thing in a landscape, these are still 9 feet tall to shoulder. It's really cool storytelling, which if you watched Photography 101 with me a few weeks ago, storytelling is such an important aspect of photography these days. Another thing, choose your background. Now, this is a really, really good one, a really important one. Choosing is kind of metaphorically choose. You can't always just snap your fingers and say, well, I want to be green or yellow, or I want to be clear, I want to be a palm tree. But the thing is when you're on foot, which again, a lot of our tropics trips are when we're going around the world, you can pivot yourself. And even though sometimes birds can be in the canopy or far away, more often than not, you can get a few different glimpses of wildlife from a few different vantage points. And if you think about it, the background of that animal changes. See, this is all background. That background of the animal changes. If I change my position from where I am right now with this mot, and I move to the left, like 20 feet, 20 paces, the background is going to swivel with me. And what if there's a clearing? What if it's all blue sky over there? Maybe I do want that, maybe I don't want it. What if it's a darker vegetation? What if it's a yellow palm tree that has really, really nice arcs? Choosing a background and moving yourself to choose your background is a hugely important way to up your photography game in the tropics, because the truth is a lot of backgrounds are chaotic. They're almost like too busy. So it can actually detract from the photo if the background isn't what you want it to be. So let's look at an example. So here we've got a cockerel civica in Madagascar, and it's a good photo. I like it, but start to notice what's going on in the background. Well, okay, let's look at this. We've got a little bit of open space right here, kind of like a peach color. This is probably the trail. We've got a branch here. It's very it's jutting out of the lemur. It's blurred, so it's out of focus, which is nice, but it's kind of defined. Your eye goes to it. You've got some open space right here, some bright spots, some sun coming in here. Okay, that's fine. But for this lemur and this species particularly, they're pretty nonchalant. They're okay with you moving around, and they're not going to spook. And frankly, a lot of wildlife is like that. So what I actually prefer is I want to look at what's going on around me. Yeah, we've spotted the wildlife. We spotted the lemur. We've spotted the monkey, the orangutan, whatever. But once we have that sighting, and once you've maybe taken your really hurried shot just to make sure you get it before it goes away, once you can tell that it's hanging around a little bit, start looking around the background. What do you want behind the animal? What do you want in the rest of your frame? And so with this cockerel civica, this lemur species up in northern Madagascar, I started seeing all this really, really nice kind of textured palms and a little bit of blue sky in the background and a little bit more uniform. If we go back to this one, see how it's just, you've got some peach, kind of sandy color, you've got some green, some light green, you've got bark over here. But notice this, a lot more uniform of blue and kind of green and yellow, like very wispy, very light. I personally like this photo a lot more. At the end of the day, that's what's most important, is whether you like your photo more by using these techniques. But I think what you'll find is if you start paying attention to the background and moving yourself, you're going to get better photos. So I can't talk about, wildlife safaris or photographing any sort of animals without talking about wildlife portraiture. This is something I've talked about in my previous presentations, but it also plays well into this idea of dealing with vegetation and shrouded backgrounds or shrouded foregrounds, hidden animals. How do you limit that distraction from that orangutan in the bush or that bird in the tree? Well, what you want to do is you want to think about it in the terms of portraiture. Okay, so we're a little bit more familiar, all of us now, with the idea of portraiture from iPhones and smartphones, because a lot of them have this portrait mode now. And what that really translates into is a shallow depth of field. So you'll notice I have some notes up here. Shots like this that allow me to blur out the background. So, my eye and the viewer's eye is not, it's not going to this area. I'm blurring the background. If you don't use aperture mode, if you're not real advanced with your camera, but you do have a point and shoot, you can find this little icon. Every single camera out there, the $50 Canon camera all the way to the $5,000 Canon camera or Nikon, whatever, it's gonna have this little icon somewhere in its menu. If you can find that, that automatically sets all the camera functions. You don't need to touch anything else. It automatically sets all the camera functions to portrait mode, and it blurs that background really nicely. So I think that plays in well with this idea of animals and shrouded scenery. If you want to minimize that distraction by unfocusing the stuff you don't want the person to focus on, because really at the end of the day, I want you to focus on the critters. I want you to focus on the wildlife. The rest of it is just background. It's supplementary to the photo. So what do I do for wildlife photography? Kind of key steps. Okay, so we talked about the shallow depth of field. The other big thing, if you haven't picked this up from previous presentations, is focus on the eyes. You've got to choose a place to focus. Your camera's going to focus on something. Make sure it focuses on the eyes. It's great if this knee is in focus. It's great if this hand's in focus and that foot's in focus and this bark's in focus. That's nice. That's fine. But if those eyes are not in focus, this is a totally different photo. The viewer, you or me, connects with this monkey, connects with this animal via the eyes. So I think it's important, if you focus on anywhere, focus on the eyes. Shallow depth of field, that's helped blur out the background, minimize distractions, realize that this is what I want you to focus on. It's a portrait. And then, focus on rules of composition. And the main one I'll talk about here, and we're not gonna spend a lot of time on rule of thirds because there are other presentations where I cover this, is, imagine this tic-tac-toe board over your screen and add significance to these intersecting points. I do try in general to not put that animal smack dab in the middle right here. If I can kind of put it around that intersecting point, slightly offset it, have the animals in these 2/3 and this third completely open, you're gonna notice that your photo is a lot more aesthetic. Again, I'm not gonna go into excruciating detail on this, but it does come down to mathematics. Things like Fibonacci sequences and Pythagorean theorems and all sorts of fancy stuff. Just trust me when I say, if you break it down on this tic-tac-toe board, add some sort of significance to these dots, these intersecting points, your photos will turn out instantly better. So that's wildlife portraiture in a nutshell. Every trip we ever do with nature and wildlife photography, these are great lessons. So remember I said, photographing in dark environments is going to be something that's very, very key and very important in the tropics. This red leaf monkey, this red langur, is actually in really, really dark scenery. This is, not too high in the canopy, but the entire canopy is over it. The rainforest is dark underneath, believe it or not. It's those tall emergent trees that get all the sunlight. So how do we deal with animals in dark environments? Well, there's a few things we can do. One, if your photo is just plain too dark, you can actually lighten it. And I'll do a quick plug to our photo cheat sheet. If you do email us, I'll show the email address at the end of the presentation. You can shoot us an email and we'll email you a digital copy of this, a PDF for your files. But basically what you want to do is you want to find in your camera settings or in your manual this little icon with the ability to lighten and darken your photo. In the camera itself, it's going to be translated or manifested into this little sliding scale, okay? If you notice that your entire photo is too dark, go ahead and lighten it up a little bit. But I'll tell you one trick I actually use for the tropics, if you're headed there, and you find that it's just too dark in the scene, you're not getting a fast enough shutter speed, is I actually will go the other direction and darken my photo to buy myself a little bit more shutter speed to focus and shoot in dark environments. You can always lighten that in Photoshop after the fact. But really more than anything, it's not so much this, It has something to do with ISO is the word of the day here. So ISO, it's very similar to what's known as ASA or film speed back in the day. It's essentially a part of your camera that it might be worth looking at your manual over, and it's going to range from 100 to usually well over 3200. And the gist is the higher the number you go, the more light sensitivity your camera gives you. Plain and simple. The more it can perceive things in dark environments. So you want to be particularly sensitive to ISO. I know a lot of folks out there today are probably not shooting on manual mode. They're not customizing their aperture or shutter speed. That's great. But one thing you ought to look into is how can you set your own ISO to allow your camera to photograph in dark environments. I promise you your photography will be much, much better. Now with that, there is a cost. If you increase your ISO to allow more light to come in, you are going to get what's known as more grain or noise in your shot. And if you've ever seen this, it almost looks like translucent sandpaper has been put over your entire photo. It's kind of got this grain texture, and ultimately decreases the overall quality of your shot. It just doesn't look as good. And that is a factor of increasing your ISO. A lot of times there's nothing you can do about it. You either get a shot with high ISO, you get the shot and it's got some grain in it, or you don't get it at all because it's too dark. But nevertheless, something you should probably look up in your camera's manual or menu is how to change your ISO. And really what I'm doing when I'm going to the tropics and I'm starting photographing in a cloud forest, in a rainforest, I'm shooting at the upper half of the spectrum, 800 to 3200. Those are the magic numbers. And I say only use as necessary. In tropics, it can be very necessary. Okay, another big topic here, adjusting for backlit wildlife. So what that means is if the light source is coming from above or behind the animal, which is fairly common in the tropics. It's not every shot, maybe it's not even half the shots, but it's common enough that you will see scenarios like this. And I think it's the bane of all photographers' existence. And it's one of the things that I actually talk about very first when I'm actually on location, when I'm actually guiding trips to the tropics on our very first night's welcome dinner, how to adjust for this, because it can be a little bit tricky, but if you know some of the main techniques, it's actually pretty quick fix. Ultimately, it's about making lemonade out of lemons. The best thing is to have the light source flipped. You don't want the light source behind, but there are techniques and tricks and tips you can use. So here's a classic scenario. We got a big male orangutan, kind of up in the trees, maybe 20 feet above the ground. Foliage covering, I've used that shallow depth of field to blur out the foreground so it's not too distracting. I'm kind of using it to frame the shot. Looks sort of hidden and enigmatic and a little bit of a mystery. But you see we have all this light back here that is toying and messing with my camera settings. And it's doing what we call washing out the photo. It's too much bright spot. So what are the techniques? Well, the first thing is dealing with yourself, moving your own body to try to minimize this. Now, a lot of times in tropics, we may not have the luxury of completely moving. We might be on a slope, we might be at one viewpoint with like a little patch in the trees. But first and foremost, if you can, look at that background, just like I showed you with the lemurs a few shots ago, and try to reposition yourself to not have that really, really, really bright spot right behind the animal. The best thing is to have evenly lit. Just because it's light doesn't mean it's a good thing. The best thing is if it's uniformly dark rather than having a really dark animal and a really light sky. So move yourself. Maybe you're on a little bit of a hill or embankment. Maybe go up or down and see, oh, does that make it better or make it worse? Move to the left or right. Try to get a uniform lighting on the animal and the background. So reposition yourself for a lower angle, minimize bright spots. The other thing you can do is, remember that slide I showed you a few slides ago where you can mess with your exposure meter. Okay, that little plus or minus, you can go -1, +1, -2, +2. What you can do is you can actually manually overexpose your shot or brighten it to allow the foreground animal or your subject to get more brightness within the photo. Now, you're not shining a flashlight or having a flash. It's all within the camera. It's just adjusting its various settings to brighten the whole scene. Okay. Now, the other thing you can do is if that's still not working, take a test shot. Okay, orangutan's way too dark. I've got to lighten the scene. Great. Overexposed by 1 full stop, +1. Great. If you're still not getting it, you can do what's known as spot metering. And I put this little icon up in the right-hand corner. This is what spot metering looks like in your camera. Every single camera has this, whether it's a point and shoot to an SLR to mirrorless to the bridge cameras, they all have this setting. If you find this in your exposure settings or your metering settings, what this does is it adjusts the exposure to only the center part of the frame. So normally what a camera does as a digital tool and instrument is it figures out the lighting scheme from edge to edge. It says, okay, bright spots here, dark spots here, bright spots here, dark spots here. Let's just choose an average lighting to capture everything. But what this setting does, spot metering, is it only exposes based on the middle of the frame, about a circle this big. You can see in relation to this circle. And what that does is it disregards all the light and dark over here and just makes sure that the middle of the frame is perfectly lit. And that's pretty good. The biggest problem here is that if you forget to set your camera back to what we call evaluative or like average metering, it can mess up your photos if you move on to a different scene, a different animal. So it's very, very specific to situations like this where you have a lot of bright mixed with one dark animal that you want to bring out the light from, okay? And then, you know, at the very end of the day, if you are comfy with post-processing, I'm talking about Photoshop, I'm talking about Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I will be doing a specific webinar, actually 2 weeks from today, mark that on your calendars, a specific webinar only on post-processing techniques, talking about Lightroom and Photoshop, how to adjust photos. But what you can do, and this is like a mantra, it's always easier and more feasible to brighten dark photos than to darken light photos. Okay, let me say that again. It's always better to take or to lighten a dark photo than to darken a light photo. So if you start off with too dark of a photo, it's much easier to rescue that in post-processing software like Photoshop and Lightroom than the other way around. It has everything to do with how cameras capture data, but that's kind of like the be-all end-all. So don't only overexpose just going what's in the back of your camera, because sometimes you can get it wrong and overexpose too much and not be able to rescue the shot if everything else is totally haloed around the animal, okay? So another great situation here, we've got an injury lemur in Madagascar. I'm trying to make lemonade out of this. You know, I'm repositioning myself. You can see these dark spots here and here. This is a little bit too bright, you know, but I'm trying to find that patch where, you know, I'm getting a good bit of lighting on the animal here, and I don't have too many of these white spots in the background. So I find where I can get some foliage. I'm moving myself. Okay, great background. So I've repositioned and I've lowered my angle as well, because oftentimes if you can get on a more equal angle with the animal, such that you're not here, the animal's up here, if you do that, you're almost always shooting into the sky. It's almost always going to be white or just too light of blue. If you can make that equal angle, that helps a lot. So I repositioned myself. I overexposed a little bit. Okay, so I go to my camera and overexpose, you know, like a little notch at a time. You don't have to go all the way to +1 or +2. You can go in third increments. I don't think I actually use this technique in this case, but remember, you can always set to spot metering, especially if you're going to be on one wildlife sighting for a long period of time. And really, for this shot, I relied on post-processing. You know, I went into Photoshop and I adjusted the exposure on this lemur to bring out some of the shadows, bring out some of the exposure in a spot kind of paintbrushy sort of way. So at the end of the day, you know, this is a good photo. I like it, but you know, this is trying to make lemonade out of a tough situation. And adjusting for backlit animals is indeed one of those really tough situations. Okay, how to take a macro shot without macro lens. I'm gonna get my camera here because I think this is, it's gonna help if I explain via interpretive dance. No, not really, but I'm gonna show you what I'm doing here. So I'm just gonna click through the various things. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here we are, we're in Madagascar, we're looking at a giraffe-necked weevil, and this is a tiny little insect. You know, it's about yay big, so it is small. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have my normal wide angle lens on. Well, actually, I should step back. If you have a point and shoot camera, you can bypass all this and just find this icon, this little flower icon on your camera. Oftentimes it's like a button in the back of your camera. You just push that and everything gets dialed in to maximize for macro mode. It's really cool. So point and shoot, that's what you do. If you have a camera with interchangeable lenses, this is what you're gonna do. The first thing you're gonna do is go to your zoom ring and zoom all the way in, okay, to the maximum ability. Then you're gonna go and set your focus to manual focus, okay? And you're gonna go and you're gonna dial your focusing ring to the minimum focusing distance. And a lot of lenses, I don't know if you can see this, I'm sure, yeah, there's no way. It actually says macro right here as I'm dialing this in. So minimum focusing distance. And then what I'm actually gonna do, so I've got maximum telephoto zoom and minimum focusing distance, is I'm actually gonna, so you know, I hold the shutter and it's not focusing because it's on manual. I'm actually gonna move into the subject until it becomes in focus, and then I'm gonna take it. And what that does is that gives you maximum telephoto power at the absolute minimum focusing distance, making that subject literally as big as it possibly can in your camera. Okay, so it's a really, really cool technique. You do not have to have a macro, and you will, at those settings, you will be on true one-to-one macro mode. It's really, really cool technique. If you have a flash, that's fantastic, great, you can use it. I just ask that, with wildlife, be cognizant that, it is a bright light, and if you're photographing a draft-necked weevil and you blast it once or twice with a flash and it never sees a human ever again, great, no problem. But a lot of times with the amphibians, frogs that tend to hang around, pools and little ponds around lodges at night, just be careful that you're not hitting them with too much flash over and over and over again. One or two, great, and that's fine. Okay, cool. So that's a great technique there. Advanced. Now, so that's those are great techniques. We're gonna still set all that, but instead of just shooting on automatic mode here, on whatever your camera gives you, you still do everything like I said. So you still zoom all the way in, you still do minimum focusing distance, but now you set your camera to manual and you dial these exact settings right here, okay? So what this is doing is providing as wide of a depth of field as possible at a decent shutter speed, at a higher ISO. And so what that does, as you're moving towards the subject to get it sharp, it maximizes focus of everything. You can see here all these little bees that were just making their lodging right at the entrance of my jungle lodge, actually in Honduras. They're really, really sharp, and that's what that depth of field does. Part of this is advanced because you're going into manual settings. Part of it's advanced as to figuring out how to do this without getting stung, and I'll tell that story for another day. Cool, so we're done with the prop for the moment. Put the lens cap on, that's always important. So we're moving on. So we're going to talk about general travel photography. We're kind of deviating a little bit from the wildlife, mainly because the tropics of the world is some of the best place for travel photography. You are in biodiverse Candyland. You are in a year-round growing season. The agricultural products, the crops, the markets, the scenery, it is so lush and vibrant that I think it's one of the most fun things to do. I love taking my groups into markets in Madagascar and Borneo and Costa Rica and wherever, because the stuff you see, you're not going to see back in Kansas. I mean, you are literally not in Kansas anymore. So the stuff you're seeing is just so photogenic and so worthy. So, one of my things here with general travel photography is, start looking for filling the frame edge to edge with interesting semi-uniform textures and colors. Great example here with the durian fruit this was in Borneo. As you're going around for general travel photography, fruit stands, markets, change your angle. Use unique angles, okay? So here I am in a market in China. This is, yeah, we'll call it the tropics. It's close enough, but it's a good illustration of what I mean here, is that we've got some ginger and some onions and some garlic. And what I'm doing is I actually have a top down, so I'll get my prop again, as I'm actually walking through the market and I'm just doing this. I'm just holding my hand out and just putting my camera straight down like a bird's eye view. And you can see what this does is give me a really, really cool composition and really cool texture here with great depth of field because everything's equal distance away from my lens. So really nice here. Use unique angles, but don't just go for top down stuff. Use unique angles and use that ultra wide angle lens that you brought with you. Get down and shoot up into the market. Get kind of some cool stuff in the close part and some blurred stuff away. Piggybacking on that, use a very shallow depth of field. I just showed you a top down photo where everything was nice and crisp. But I think a lot of times showing depth, the volumes, the bushels of chilies or peppers or garlic or ginger, whatever you're photographing, have that shallow depth of field like we talked about for portrait setting. Remember, for point and shoot folks, just find this little portrait setting. For aperture folks, f2.8 to 5.6 and show that depth that, oh my gosh, the chilies just go on forever. It's really, really cool. We often get questions about, how, and this is something I probably could have covered in previous webinars as well, but this is a great time to cover it here, is, well, what about people photography? What about cultural photography? I think that it's so wonderful and such a treat to interact with folks, whether it's, in Thailand and Myanmar, Southeast Asia, in Africa, in the tropics of the world, because it's just amazing people, amazing personalities, and I love photographing people as well. The trick to that, and the universal symbol, if you don't speak the language of, can I take your photo, is just to hold up your camera and just nod. This is the universal symbol. And people will either say nope, or they'll say, yeah. Most of the time they'll be a little bit shy. But that's the main thing, is when photographing people, there are no universal rules. Just be respectful that some people will want it, some people will not. And for every single person, you should always ask. Okay, so we're nearing the end here, and I want to talk about a big topic: issues with camera fogging in the tropics. So we talked about this in polar regions. It's still very, very applicable here in the tropics. It's the exact same and the exact opposite at the same time of how it all works, okay? So it's the exact same in the sense that the reason your camera may fog is you're super cooling your camera and you're taking it into a warm environment. But it's the exact opposite in the fact that, you know, when we're up in the Arctic photographing northern lights and we're outside in cold environments and go inside a warm building that might have a humidifier, we're going inside to make it fog. It's the exact opposite in tropical environments. What's happening here is we're usually coming from our air-conditioned or slightly climate-controlled, temperature-controlled room with a little bit cooler of a camera body out into the humid, warm tropical jungle. Okay, so the issue is when we're starting out our days, or when we're starting out our photography after lunch or in the afternoon, after letting that camera sit inside for a little while, taking it outside for the first time, even a vehicle. Let's say we're doing a 2-hour drive to the trailhead and we're in an air-conditioned vehicle. Taking out for the first time is that danger zone. Okay, so why does it happen? Let's talk about this first. So I showed this last time, very similar thing. Imagine yourself on a beach in Florida or on a lake on a summer day, and it's kind of humid, and you have an ice chest, a cooler full of soda or pop, again, depending on where you're from. But it's cool, it's cold, it's you know, it's like right around 33 degrees. They're very, very cold metal. And what you do is you take that can out and you crack it, and within just a minute, that can has all this sweat around it, all this condensation. And what you're doing is you're super cooling a metal, and you're taking that metal out into a humid environment. And what's happening is that humid environment has a lot of gaseous liquid, right? It's got like water vapor, it's got humidity. And that can, you know, stretch back, think back to like 10th grade chemistry or physics or whatever. That can is turning that liquid, or sorry, that gaseous humidity, that gaseous water into a liquid, okay? So when you cool a gas, it turns into a liquid. And so what it's doing is it's basically getting that gas to condensate on the can. So the exact same thing happens for your camera. Okay, so what happens is this camera sits in my room all at night, and maybe my jungle lodge has air conditioning, like a lot more of them do these days. And let's just say it's, you know, 78 degrees, you know, not cold, but then you walk out into let's just say 95-degree high humidity environment. Even though you wouldn't think that that camera is cold like it would be cold in the northern Arctic, it's still much colder to the environment. And so that cold camera body is actually turning that humidity from the warm environment into condensation on the tip of the lens. And it is annoying. It is really, really hard to get rid of. You can have a lens cloth and wipe it off, but in 2 seconds, it's gonna form right back again. So how do I deal with it? Okay, so there are a few ways. First and foremost, what you should never do is you should never take the lens cap off immediately in this scenario. So when you're leaving a cooler environment, i.e. when you're leaving your room, when you're leaving an air-conditioned vehicle, when you're leaving a restaurant and you go to photograph, fortunately here it's an open air restaurant, so it's a moot point, but when you're leaving a climate-controlled space and you get outside and it's warm and humid, you should not immediately take your lens cap off, okay? That's first and foremost. That's gonna help you a lot. You know, in a lot of cases, if you don't have extremes, like you don't have extreme humidity or extreme air conditioning, that's gonna be enough to help not get condensation and fog into your lens. But usually what people will do, especially in places like Borneo that happens to be quite humid, is you'll actually put your camera bag outside your room for a little bit of time. The amount of time is extremely variable. It totally is based on the situation, but I'm talking about like maybe a half an hour. So what I'll do is I'll come down to breakfast in the morning at my jungle lodge. Maybe my room's been air conditioned, but this is a nice open air restaurant. I'll bring my camera bag with me, and I'll put it down. We'll start eating, drinking coffee, having fun, talking about photography around the breakfast table, but I'll unzip my bag and just kind of gently prop it open so that humidity or not humidity, but the warmth slowly warms the camera so that it's not shocked. That's the whole thing, is you're trying to gradually warm the camera so it's not within like a matter of seconds going from cold to warm. And usually it takes anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes to do so. Okay, so that's a general MO. Some people, some pro photographers actually, you know, like the real deal hardcore ones will not even turn air conditioning on in their rooms at night. I know I mean, trust me, I'm not suggesting you necessarily do that, but that's the only fail-safe, is never cooling your camera off that much. Some people will, as they're getting ready in the morning before coming to breakfast, they'll just put their camera bag outside their room, and maybe just unzip it a little bit. Now you got to be, concerned about safety and where you're at, not necessarily people, but oftentimes, if you're in a jungle lodge where wildlife is around, maybe monkeys come in and want to see what's in your bag. So you got to be careful with that. Some people, if you're on a raised veranda, will even put it on their porch that is protected from people and wildlife. It's all kind of up to you. I would definitely ask your photo guide, if you are on a photo trip, what they think is going to be the best procedure. But really what we're talking about is a slow warming in the matter of about 15 to 30 minutes. And that usually does a trick. Combine that with keeping your lens cap on before you actually need to take photographs, and you're great. Okay, you prevented your camera from fogging in tropical environments. Congratulations. Okay, just rounding it out here. So before we conclude, I wanted to tune you and turn you on to a very, very valuable resource. We have the naturalphotographer.org. This is a website here at Natural Habitat Adventures that is a great, great resource, ranging from general tips like how to instantly elevate your wildlife photography to, what's in my camera bag for an African safari, for a tropical adventure. A lot of the stuff I've been talking about today in writing with example photos, how to get this photo. If you're in Borneo and you want to photograph a sun bear, how do you get a shot like that? So zoom on over here, bookmark it, check it frequently. I write new articles weekly. And lastly, I want to thank you for your attention. Remind you, if you do want to email us here at info@nathab.com and ask for the photo cheat sheet, we'll send one out your way via PDF. I know this orangutan loves it. He is constantly, clambering over the trees to find the most freshly picked cheat sheets. But you can get your hands on one as well if you'd like. And anyway, I want to make sure we save some time for questions. So with that, I'll end and thank you.
All right, Court. Thank you so much. I love your last slide here. It's really funny. Let me start with this question for you. Do you change lenses in a tropical environment at the risk of humidity compromising the sensor?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I will really try to not do so within that first 15 to 30 minutes or maybe even first hour. Like I'll probably do my lens changing before I leave the room, and then I probably won't change it again until, again, 30 minutes, an hour. Fortunately, a lot of the good cameras these days are weather sealed, so it's, you don't have to worry about it too much. But technically, anytime you're in a humid environment, there could be humidity seeping through, so you want to be careful as well. But yeah, I do change, just getting outside of that danger zone of camera fogging.
Okay. We have a couple of ISO questions for you. This one, when you are in the rainforest, do you set your camera to ISO only, or do you use full manual? The comment is, I like to use ISO because too often on full manual, I miss the shot by the time I've got everything set.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I am a big advocate of simplicity, and for many, many years, I was not photographing on full manual. I was photographing on aperture mode because these cameras are so good nowadays that I don't need to choose my aperture and my shutter speed and my ISO. It's too much to fuss with when an orangutan is sweeping through the trees trying to get after my cheat sheet. Kidding, this is photoshopped in there in PowerPoint. But yeah, I do not change all that at once. What I've actually been doing recently, is I've been shooting on full manual mode, but I've been putting it on auto ISO. Now, the thing is, the reason I've been doing that only recently is I got a new camera about 2 years ago, and it's only the newer cameras that allow you to do that. So you can put it on full manual. I know the aperture. I know I want to shoot at, let's say, f/5.6. I know I need my shutter speed to be fast enough to prevent hand movement. So I'm like shooting at 1/200, let's just say. These are just examples. But then I'm going to let the camera choose the ISO for me based on those conditions and based on the lighting. And I've noticed, I mean, you can do it either way. You can shoot on aperture, let the camera choose the shutter speed, and then you choose the ISO, so you're choosing 2 of the 3 things. But I've noticed what's happening is that my camera is giving me better ISO than I would have assumed it to give. And remember, the lower the ISO numbers, the better the photo is going to be in the end. So yeah, I am, the thing that I'm always choosing, that I'm definitely always choosing, is the aperture. If you're not quite there yet in your photography, don't worry. Practice makes perfect. I would recommend maybe checking out my Nature Photography 102 webinar. So 102, we talk a lot about changing aperture and how to do so and when to do so. But that's the only thing I always change. And then again, lately I've been doing that auto ISO thing, so I've been getting really, really good results.
Hmm. Okay, good. Thank you. We actually had somebody asking about aperture priority and shutter priority, so referring back to that other webinar would be a good one.
Yeah, that's a great webinar to check out. You know, I've got several on our YouTube channel, several on our website. There's Nature Photography 101. We talk a lot about composition. We talk about general ideas of lighting and storytelling and impression with photography. And then 102 gets into more of the technical aspect of why to slow down your shutter speed, why to increase shutter speed, and why to use wide versus shallow depths of field with corresponding apertures. Really good one to check out if you want to really next level your photography. I think it's critical to get into understanding aperture more than anything else.
Okay, thanks. Another question for you. This one from Robin. She says, sometimes I try taking a close-up photo with my 24 to 105 millimeter lens, and the camera will not let me take the photo. Sometimes if I back up, it will then take the photo. What is happening?
Yeah, great question. So every lens out there, not camera, but every lens has what's known as a minimum focusing distance. And you can either Google your lens and just ask, you know, Canon 24 to 70 minimum focusing distance. It's probably going to say, you know, like 0.9 meters or, you know, 1.5 feet, something like that. That is the closest you can get, or the optics, just the physics, the optics of the lens will not let you focus any closer than that. That's when you get into big money in specialized macro lenses. You can focus like this close, so the insect or the frog just appears so much bigger in your frame. What I recommend doing to abate that issue that you have, Robin, is go ahead and set your camera on manual mode. I think that's gonna be huge, because what's happening is your autofocus is probably going vroom, 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 vroom. Your camera will always take a shot on manual mode. There's no focusing halfway step. And again, what you do is if you start out, like start way outside of that minimum focusing distance and gradually move in, and you'll know, like this lens, for instance, has a minimum of, I don't know, like 2 feet, 2.5 feet. So as soon as I get 2.5 feet from a subject, it starts becoming really clear in my lens. And then I start taking photos as I get closer and closer. And somewhere within that, there's a sweet spot that it will be in tack sharp focus. But yeah, if you're on autofocus and your lens is not, or your camera's not taking the photo, it's probably because you're too close.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, I'm going to stop there, Court. This has been terrific, and I'm going to turn it back to you for closing comments.
Well, gosh, yeah, I love the tropics. I love everything there is to photograph there, whether it's from the market scenes to the wildlife, of course, to the landscapes. There's so much great about the tropics. You know, make sure when things are back up again, put that on your short list. Places like Borneo, Madagascar, they need our help with conservation travel just as much as they are spectacular places to photograph. So I hope to see you out there. I lead a lot of those trips, so it'd be great to be photographing alongside you with a cool orangutan like this in the trees. So thanks once more. Give us an email, ask for that cheat sheet, and it does talk about all the things I was talking about at the end here with aperture and shutter speeds and ISO and the reasons behind it as well. So it's a really nice tool. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks so much, Court. And we'll be back with Court tomorrow. He is going to be with us live with Ben Bressler, and that's our Daily Dose of Nature tomorrow. Same time, we hope to see you all there. And with that, we will say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.